Recording. So good morning, everybody. Glad to have everybody with us. So first of all, we are recording this, and last month we did record and saved it, and just having a little bit of issue with getting the file compressed because it's such a big audio file. But once we get that figured out, then Sean will have it loaded up into the Digital Resource Center on the website, so you can listen to that and all future calls. So they'll all be posted up there. Yep. Good morning, as always, with the fundamental of the week. And so for HPC, our fundamental of the week this week is practicing blameless problem solving. And this is one that I think is in every single one of our clients. And if they don't think of it on their own, I almost always recommend it because I think it has such impact in an organization that, you know, when you have a blame-filled environment, which is what most people are used to, in blame-filled environments, people learn not to try anything, not to take any chances, not to take any risks. They don't solve things because they're just so worried about deflecting blame. And I often will say to people in a rollout, you know, what happens when you get blamed? And most people will quickly respond that, you know, our natural response to getting blamed is defensiveness. That, you know, somebody says, hey, it was your fault. The first thing that we want to say is, hey, it wasn't my fault. You don't understand. And we make up all the reasons and all the excuses for why it wasn't our fault, or sometimes we even blame somebody else. And when we're doing that, what we're not doing is we're not solving any problems. So I'd like to emphasize that there are three things that matter most when problems happen. One is, let's fix the darn thing. Who cares whose fault it is? Let's just figure out what do we got to do to fix it. Second thing we care about is after we have fixed it, let's go back and do a little autopsy on the situation to see if we can discover what took place here. Not for the purpose of blaming, but rather just so that we can make sure we got smarter from the experience. And the third thing that matters that is often forgotten is, how are we going to go back and take that learning and integrate it into our processes and in some way make some improvement to our processes so we don't keep repeating the same mistake? Because unless we make some improvement in our process, well, then it's just an intellectual learning, but it didn't really translate into any change. So we always want to make sure that we've improved our processes to reflect or integrate what we've learned. That's what matters. What doesn't matter is who the heck screwed up. And it's so fascinating that when companies can let go of the blame thing, again, it frees everybody up to own up to a mistake, to ask a question, to try a risk, to take a new challenge. But in an environment where everybody's worried about getting blamed, nobody's willing to do any of that. So it's just a huge impact on organizations, and one that most companies struggle with. And in fact, if you look at our whole society, you know, we're quick to blame. You look at any time there's a lawsuit, the first thing everybody wants to know is, whose fault was it? Who can we assign blame to? And sometimes you even think about the cover your ass mentality. You know, what is that? Cover your ass is really an anticipation of blame. I'm expecting that I'm going to get blamed, so in advance I'm going to do these things to prevent you from being able to point the finger at me. What a waste of time and energy, but common when we have blame-filled environments. So this is just a huge impact on companies. And it's why it was one of my very original ones at RSI and why it's one of the HPC ones. So questions or thoughts or comments from anybody about this week's fundamental?
David, I have, this is Ed Curry, I have a member who has an investment from a private equity fund who put in a new CEO. And I was there with my member last week and we were talking about a problem that happened. I said, oh, is the new guy a pin the tail on the donkey type guy or a collaborative problem solving guy? He said, oh, Ed, he's a pin the tail on the donkey guy. And so my point is, people recognize it when you are someone like that.
Yeah. Well, and most organizations tend to be that way. The other thing that I often try to remind people about this is that even when we do create a blame-free environment, people will still often be defensive just because they've spent their whole life up until this point getting used to being blamed. So if you grew up in a family in which there was a lot of blame, or you worked in other environments in which there was a lot of blame, it just gets really natural to become defensive. And so even when we're not blaming anybody, you'll often hear somebody say, it wasn't my fault, as if like, well, nobody's worrying about that. So it takes a while to get people used to letting go of their defensiveness, and it frees us up to just start focusing on solving things. So it's a big one. All right. So our agenda today, like last time, what I want to do is I want to take a couple of other fundamentals and just talk a little bit more in depth about them. And again, my goal in doing that is the deeper and more familiar you are with the fundamentals, the more agile you are when you're facilitating a first day facilitation, the more agile you are when you're doing a rollout. So the more you understand the fundamentals, the more you have lots of language and verbiage you can use to talk about and teach them, the more effective you're going to be as a consultant and facilitator. So every time we'll take at least 2, sometimes 3 fundamentals, and I'll just do a little bit deeper dive on some of the things I like to teach about that fundamental. So that's the first thing we'll do. Second thing we'll do is I want to spend each time a little bit of time talking about the whole process of facilitating this, the fundamentals process, and I'll just take 1 or 2 small elements of it and just do a little deeper dive on that. Third thing we want to talk about is some marketing thoughts and ideas, and these will be just either new ideas I've had or just things that have popped into my head recently or a reflection of questions I'm hearing from others. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that and then wrap it up with anything that you have other questions about, things you're running into. So if somebody could mute that, that would be good. But we'll spend a little bit of time at the end just going through things you're bumping into, questions, prospects you're running into, things you want. Maybe you've run into a prospect and they asked a question, you didn't know the best way to answer it, and it would be useful to hear a little bit more about that, because whatever you're running into, everyone else on the phone is probably also running into, so we can all share in those experiences. So that's our plan for today. So a couple fundamentals. I'd like to talk about celebrating success, because that's one that comes up in almost every client. And I'm almost sure that I didn't talk about this one last time. So does anybody remember, did I talk about this one last time? Because if so, I'll skip it.
No.
Okay. If I didn't, then let's do that one. So celebrating success is one that comes up in pretty much every single client. And in the old RSI days, I used to call this practicing acknowledgement and appreciation. It was an original collaborative way practice. But it's a really important one. And what I teach when I emphasize this is that when we can create an environment where everybody is regularly acknowledging each other in meaningful ways, it's really a powerful incentive, it's a powerful stimulant to higher performance. And there's a really big distinction here between acknowledging people in meaningful ways and meaningless ways. So meaningless acknowledgement is the everybody wins a trophy kind of culture. You know, isn't everybody great here just because they showed up? And you see a lot of this fluffy, you know, just throwing out, oh, everybody's wonderful, everybody works so hard here. No, they don't. Some do and some don't. And to throw out meaningless acknowledgement really has 2 negative impacts. The first negative impact is that, you know, it undermines the ability to give real acknowledgement. So if I always say everybody's great and Ed does something really good and I want to say, Ed, that was a fantastic job on what you just did, if I say that to everybody all the time, even when it's not, I have no power left to give him anything meaningful, because it's just a bunch of BS. I say that all the time, even if this time I really mean it. So it undermines the power I have to give a meaningful acknowledgement. Second thing that meaningless acknowledgement does is it creates a standard of mediocrity. If what gets acknowledged around here and gets, you know, appreciated is fairly average work, and everything that's even average, I say, oh, that's just great. Well, then that's the standard people learn to work to. You know, why do anything better if what you get acknowledged for is just fairly average work? So it just creates a standard of mediocrity. So we don't want to be doing meaningless acknowledgement, you know, just to quote unquote make people feel good, because that's just useless. What we want to practice is meaningful acknowledgement. And there are 3 aspects of acknowledgement that make it more meaningful. The first is that it's specific. If we're acknowledging something very specific, it has more meaning attached to it. When I talk about this in a rollout, I'll often pick on a particular employee and I'll ask them what their role is. So I'll see somebody, I'll ask that person, you know, so what do you do here? And I have them explain to me. And let's say that they say that they're they're in the warehouse and they're in charge of shipping. So I'll use them as an example to help illustrate what I mean by each of these elements of meaningful acknowledgement. So I'll say that, the first thing is it's got to be specific. So if I say, John, I saw you in the warehouse the other day and how you were able to get out so many shipments. I mean, I saw we got crushed with all the new things that came in, and you had every one of those logged in, tagged, and then out the next day so quickly. It was just amazing. That's specific versus good work lately, John. What is it exactly that the guy did that we're acknowledging? The more specific we are, the more meaningful it is, and the more he's likely to be able to repeat that behavior. If it's just a generalized good work lately, he doesn't even know what it is we're acknowledging, and so how is he going to repeat that? So the first thing is to be specific. The second thing that makes acknowledgement meaningful is when it's always honest. So there's no room for ever saying to somebody, that was really good work if it really wasn't. Sometimes people do that again just to make people feel good, but it has the opposite impact. So it always has to be honest. It always has to be specific. And the third thing that makes it meaningful is to talk about the impact of what somebody did. So if I say to go back to my warehouse example, I say to this guy, John, I saw, that big shipment that all that stuff came in all at the same time, and somehow you were able to get it all organized and labeled correctly and then out the door to our customers. That was amazing. And I got a call from one of our customers just yesterday talking about how quickly they got their product, and they're going to be placing more orders now. That's the impact of what the guy did versus just saying, good job. So if you make sure it's honest, you're very specific about what you're acknowledging, and you talk about the impact of what somebody did, that's a full, rich, deep, meaningful acknowledgement. The other thing that we want to emphasize when we teach about acknowledgement and celebrating success is that this is not a one-directional thing. It's not, as a manager, I should be acknowledging my people. Yes, I should be, but my people should be acknowledging me. People should be acknowledging each other, peer to peer. It's a multi-dimensional thing that in all directions throughout the company, everybody should be acknowledging each other in meaningful ways. And when that happens, when it's happening, as long as it's real and it's meaningful, you create an environment that's uplifting, where people feel good, they stand taller, they work better, they feel better about their day. And so it has real impact. The other thing that I sometimes will emphasize, just as one other teaching point on this fundamental, is how to receive acknowledgement. Because it's interesting that most of us, at a certain level, we love to be acknowledged, and yet we're bashful about it. And so when somebody acknowledges you, frequently the way they'll respond is they'll say, it was nothing, it was no big deal, I was just doing my job. And when we throw off that acknowledgement, somebody just worked so hard to give you this really deep, meaningful acknowledgement, and you toss it off as if it was nothing, you invalidate, this effort that they put in. And so we want to learn instead to just acknowledge an acknowledgement by saying, thank you, I appreciate you noticing, and just soak it up and just appreciate it, and don't toss it off as if it was nothing. So a lot of things that one can teach around acknowledgement and appreciation. It's a deep, full, fundamental, and again, I think we have it in, if not every single client, pretty close to every client, because I think it's just so important. Even if the client doesn't think of it themselves, I'll usually recommend this one. Any questions about acknowledging appreciation or celebrating success?
David?
Yep.
Sal, in your example, like with the warehouse, is that something, do you try to, when you're using something case specific like that with a client at a rollout, try to find out a little bit more about, you know what I mean, before you assume something works a certain way, or do you not worry about it to make the example? You know what I mean?
I don't worry about it. I don't worry about it, Al. I just make it up on the spot. So okay. I pick anybody in the audience. Yep. Because I really want to make it as relevant as I can. So I pick anybody in the audience, and I don't know what their position is or what their role is. They could be a salesperson, they could be in the warehouse, they could be anything. And I just ask them, explain to me what you do. And I have, and if they, if they say, well, I'm a systems engineer, I might say, well, tell me what you do on a day-to-day basis. What does that look like? Because I need enough material to make them a good example. So I'm looking for them to just describe for me what their day-to-day activities look like, and then I can figure out how to give them a meaningful acknowledgement as an example.
Gotcha.
So that's how I'll do that. Okay?
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Let's take, you're welcome. Let's take one more fundamental, and that is assume positive intent. This one comes up in probably, I'd say about half our clients have this one. In my original ones from RSI, this was called work from the assumption that people are good, fair, and honest. But I usually call it these days assume positive intent. And what I emphasize with this one is a couple things. First of all, that you will get mostly what you look for. And we know this about life, that if you go around life assuming that everybody is a jerk and everybody's a cheat and they're all out to screw you, you'll tend to see people that way. They'll show up that way in your vision, in your world. And if you treat most people as if they're good, fair, and honest, and they're good people and they want to do the right thing, they tend to show up to be more that way. And so you'll get a lot of what you're looking for. And so, I say I'd rather start from the assumption, I don't know you yet, and I don't know anything about you. Before I know anything, I'm going to start by assuming that you're a good person, that you want to do the right thing, that you're fair, that you're honest, that you're a decent person. I also find that, I often say to people that if I go through life, if it were possible that if I went through life being cynical and assuming that everybody's a jerk and everybody's out to screw you, if that's the way I approach life, if it were possible that by doing that I would never get burned, and never get taken advantage of. And that isn't true. But if it were somehow true, it still wouldn't be worth the price. That it's a miserable way to go through life. And so even at the risk of once in a while getting burned because I naively believe the best in people, that's worth it because it's just a happier, more productive way to go through life. So it's just healthier that way. But I do think that people will generally live up to your expectation of them. Trust sort of falls into this category, that when you trust people, they're, in a sense, they're screwed because they have a higher burden of responsibility to live up to than when you don't trust them. I often use the example of your kids. If you trust your kids and you say to them, I trust you guys to do the right thing right now, well, then they're totally screwed because they have to live up to that. If you don't trust them, and you're checking up on every little thing, then they try to get away with things. But when you say, I trust you, man, now they really got to live up to it. An example I used to think of often in RSI, some here know and others don't, that there were several partners who had equity shares in the company. And when we did shareholder agreements that talked about what happens if somebody dies or becomes disabled and other things like that, the attorney would always be surprised because he would say, well, does everybody else, he would just work with me and he'd say that, should everybody else have their attorneys, look at this? And I'd say, no, they're not going to do that. I'm going to tell them where to sign and they're going to trust me. And that put a great burden of responsibility on me. The fact that everybody was just going to sign whatever I told them meant that I had to live up to that and I had to take extra care to make sure I was doing what was in everybody's best interest. And I wouldn't have as high a burden if they were just going to all show it to their own people. So when you are trusted, it creates a tremendous burden of responsibility to really do the right thing. One of the things I also like to emphasize about assuming positive intent is that, in a certain way, it forces us to be more intellectually rigorous. And what I mean by that is it's really easy if we assume that most people are jerks or trying to cheat you. It's easy when you see something that looks at you see somebody acting in a way that doesn't look trustworthy or doesn't look fair or honest. If we just simply say, oh, they're just a jerk, you know how they are, well then in a sense it's intellectually lazy. I don't have to do any work to understand them. But if I really truly believe that most people are good people, that most people are honest and fair and want to do the right thing, and I see Al doing something that doesn't look fair, believe he's a fair guy, then I got to stop and think about it a little bit more, and I got to put some effort into understanding Al and say to myself, something, I know Al's a good guy. What he did right now doesn't look like a good thing. maybe I should be more curious. Maybe I better ask more questions. Maybe there's more to the story that I don't know, and I should go find out more instead of just assuming he's a jerk. So it's more work, but I'm going to have a better understanding than if I just dismissively say, he's a jerk, you know how he is. So again, I think there's a certain intellectual laziness with just passing people off as jerks. The last thing that I'll say about this is that sometimes I'll ask, if we're talking about this in a rollout, I might ask a group of people, so, if I go into a new situation and I don't know somebody, what's the difference between having a neutral mentality, like, I'm not going to judge anybody until I know them, versus assuming positive intent? And what I'm looking for people to understand is, I go into a situation and I don't know you yet. There's three ways that there's probably more than this, but at least three basic ways I could approach it. One is I could assume you're a jerk. Second is I could be non-judgmental and say, hey, I don't know this guy. I'm going to wait and see. I'm not going to judge him until I see him better. And the third is assuming positive intent. So being non-judgmental is good, but assuming positive intent is actually a more aggressive posture in the positive way. It's more than just being non-judgmental. It's saying, I don't know you yet. Not only am I not going to judge, but I'm going to assume that you're a good person, that you're fair and honest and a decent person, you want to do the right thing. So that's actually a way stronger position to be in than simply, I don't know you, I'm going to be non-judgmental. And I want to help people see that difference. So assuming positive intent is a much stronger orientation to positivity and optimism. So questions or thoughts about that fundamental?
David, is Ed Curry, what about a section of an organization who's naturally questioning? I'm thinking of controller or auditor types. Mm-hmm. They almost live life that way. I wonder your reaction to that.
They do. They're the same way, Ed. That, attorneys, by their very nature of their work, they have to look at things and say, let's plan for, if somebody tries to screw you, how do we write this, contract in a way that'll protect you? So it is a really jaded, miserable way to go through life. It is, and I guess from a purely professional standpoint, if I'm an auditor, yes, it is my job to look carefully to make sure that nobody's getting screwed here and that the accounting is being done in the proper way, and to look in a forensic kind of way to find out what might have happened here. And yet it's going to be really challenging, not impossible, but challenging for those kind of people to do that in the day-to-day minutia of their work, but not in their relationships. To somehow separate that, because it's challenging because they do get very conditioned to think that way, and it can leak into their relationships and start to see human behavior that way. So I think it's a really valid point you're raising, and yet a tough way to go through life.
Agreed.
Yeah. Other thoughts or observations or questions about that fundamental? All right. So let's switch gears, and I want to start to talk a little bit about the process of creating fundamentals. And what I want to focus on this morning is just giving a little more insight in a real-life example, excuse me, about the process of writing a set of fundamentals for somebody, and then the editing process when you're going back and forth with the client, where they're giving you feedback and you're editing from there. And so I'm going to use an example. Actually, Al Kerno had a chance to participate in a first day facilitation that we did with a client called Precision Digital up in the Boston area. And so we did the first day facilitation, and as you may remember from the training, what I usually do is I'm writing up on a whiteboard or on flip charts just the notes that came from that, what were the fundamentals that came up, and I'm writing down those notes, and then I go home and I draft a first set of fundamentals for them. And so I'm going to show you, I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, cool. I want to show you version 1. Yeah. Let's see. Let me view this so you can see this a little bit bigger. So this was a draft. This is exactly what it looks like. So I'll create a Word document, and I went through all the notes that I had, and I wrote this first set of fundamentals. And the first set had, how many we had? We had 30 fundamentals in the first set. And then one thing that I'll often do is I listed others to consider. So sometimes we'll have come up with them, and then when I go home and I think about the fundamentals and I think about what I learned from that client, sometimes there might be a few that didn't come up in our discussion, but on further review, I think he might want to consider this. So I'll just list them in a others to consider. And this is exactly how I typically write them, that I'll usually put in bold the name of the fundamental in bold and capitals, and then I'll write my description in paragraph kind of form. And again, in doing this, you can simply take, the cards that I gave you and the samples that I've given you of other fundamentals. You've got the whole laundry list of all the fundamentals we've ever written. And so they're a great starting place that as you take notes from somebody and think about how to write them, just go to those notes, start there, and then you can tweak it for anything that might be specific about that particular client. I'll give you an example of where I wrote something. So if we look at number 7, deliver results, the first part of this description comes out of the standard language around delivering results. But there was a comment that the CEO said when we were together with him that's sort of one of his phrases. And he has this phrase, he says, make something happen that otherwise wouldn't have. And what that meant in his business was he's a guy that by the nature of their business, there's a certain amount of sales that just come in just automatically, just because they have a product and people need it and they keep doing repeat orders. So even if you don't do anything, a certain amount of business is going to come in. And he's always wanting to emphasize to his people, well, beyond that, that's going to happen anyway. Do something that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't done this. Create something new. So I put that sentence into the description of deliver results. So it's just a simple example of taking the normal standard kind of language and making small tweaks here and there to make it more specific where appropriate to any particular language that you may have heard. So this was the first set that I sent to the guy 24 to 48 hours after we had met. And I'll usually send instructions saying, okay, when you get this, go ahead and review this with your team and then get back to me with feedback. And I usually warn them a couple things. One is, don't worry about the order at this point. We'll worry about that later. Secondly, I try to tell them not to spend their time editing. Just give me the feedback, because I don't want them to waste a lot of time trying to do the writing for me. Just give me feedback and we'll go from there. This client was a little slower than normal in the feedback. I had to follow up a couple times, just the way he is. Some people are quick about feedback, some are slower. So I followed up a couple times. He met with his leadership team, got some feedback from them, and then he sent me a document that looked like this. And let me just enlarge this so you can see this a little bit better. So he sent me back with just a couple of notes about things, like in this first one about delivering extraordinary customer experiences. He noted that every person in their company is empowered to spend up to $250 to fix a problem. And when I spoke to him about this, I suggested to him that we probably don't want to write something that specific in their fundamentals, because someday it might be 300 or 500, or he might get rid of it. So I think that's a teaching point he can use when he's teaching about that fundamental, but I don't necessarily want to write it into the fundamental itself. So what I did is we got on the phone and we literally went through every one of these, and we talked about his comments to make sure that I understood his comments. And so what happens when we do this is sometimes when we're going over these comments, typically what I suggest is if I don't understand exactly what he was trying to communicate, I'll ask him, explain to me more. What was your thinking here? And then I'll explain to him what my thinking was for why I wrote it, and then we'll come to an agreement. So sometimes we do this back and forth, and he'll say, okay, I see your point, never mind, leave it the way you had it. Or sometimes I'll say, okay, I get what you're trying to say. Let me see if I can find a way to word that works better for you. And so we literally will go through every one. We'll talk about them. We'll talk about which ones maybe should get deleted or which ones might get added. And it's just a good discussion. And, I always emphasize that it is better to have a client be really picky and go over every single word and every single statement. That's better than having somebody who, gets your first draft and says, oh, looks good to me. Because if that's all they're doing, then it's not going to be very helpful. I'm getting some feedback there. Are you hearing that feedback?
A little bit.
Hopefully that goes away. So again, you'd rather have somebody who's picky and being granular and going over every element, because it's the end product is going to be that much more polished, that much more fine-tuned when there's this back and forth intellectual exchange with him or her giving you good feedback and you responding to that. So we went over this, and then when we finished that, this particular client, and this doesn't usually happen, but this particular client also wanted me to send him the list, just a headline list of other fundamentals, because he wanted to see if there's anything else he might want to add. And in our conversation, there were 4 or 5 others he wanted to think about adding. So he knows he's going to have to eliminate some. So this was the first draft. After we did that, I sent him a second draft, and this was my second draft. So in my second draft, I made the various, and I usually label it, version 2, and I made the various changes that we had discussed, and then added, there were, a number that we added, so we now have 36. And in my email to him, I suggested, though it's not required, I really try not to go over 30. I think 30 is kind of a good maximum. I have a couple at 31, but try not to go over 30. And I suggested to him 5 or 6 that I thought would be good candidates to eliminate if we had to eliminate something. But he was going to show this to his team, and so this week I'll be on the phone with him to go over this next version. So this is what it looks like when we go back and forth with a client. One of the things that often happens in a first edit, when we send it to them and then they give us our feedback, is that frequently, this didn't happen in this case, but frequently the client and their team will have suggested a number that could be combined. They'll come back and say, we think we could get the number down a little bit if we combine number 3, 6, 7, and 9, and we think 12, 13, and 14 are kind of similar. And often I look at it and think, no, I don't think I'd want to combine those. But we discuss them. And generally, the way that I decide when should it be combined and when shouldn't it is I'll explain. Let's say that the client says, I think we could combine these 2. What I'll do is I'll first say, well, let me explain to you what the difference is first. Let me show you what's the essence of number 3 really means this, and number 6 really means this. So here's what I'm trying to communicate with each of those. And then we can talk about, if each of those is important enough to teach on its own, it would be a shame to lose some of the real key elements of that because we combined it into one. Or sometimes I'll look and say, you know what, I think those are close enough. We could probably put those together. I'll give you an example of one that I sometimes will put together. Deliver results and follow up everything. Sometimes, an element of getting the results is you got to follow up on things to just get it done. If you follow up enough, you're going to make sure things get done and not just work on them. So those are elements that I could blend into one fundamental if we needed to. But there are many other times where sometimes I've seen communicate to be understood and speak straight. Well, speaking straight is about being direct and honest with somebody and having difficult conversations. Communicating to be understood is really about using simple language and the understanding your audience and using language and vocabulary that they get. Those are really very different conversations. I mean, yes, they're both about speaking, but they're very different concepts, and I wouldn't want to combine those. So again, it's a very common experience to have a client suggest combinations, and you want to help them as the facilitator and consultant. You want to help them discern the distinctions between one fundamental and another so that we can make a better decision about whether we should combine these or whether we shouldn't. So that's just a little bit more depth about process look like? Typically, we're going to go through anywhere between 3 and 5 versions to get to a final version, in my experience. So that's what that looks like. Questions about the writing and editing process with a client?
David, this is Diane.
Yes.
When you talked about other things to consider, you mentioned, I believe, that the CEO wanted to see some other things. Are there situations where they don't say they want to see other things, but after the facilitation you say, oh, I should include a few of these for their consideration anyway?
Yes, so it's a good question. Typically, this request by this guy was unusual. So normally what happens is in the first day facilitation, you know, I've facilitated, I've asked the questions, and we've written up all the stuff on the flip charts. And then, as we've talked about in training, then at that stage, I'm going to share with them either examples of other fundamental cards we've had, and or share with them the cards the deck of cards that I gave to each of you. So that's going to be their way to see lots of other ones. So since they've seen all of those, it would be unusual, though it did happen in this particular case, it would be unusual for them later to say, could I look at a list of all the potential fundamentals? Because we've already looked at that and added the ones that we want. So it doesn't normally happen. It did in this particular case. I don't really know why he thought of that, but it led us to add a few more now, which we typically would have added much earlier than this.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions about that process? All right. I want to show you one other thing process related. And Sean sent this out to everybody, but I want to show you where it is because I think it's a worthwhile piece. So in the Resource Center on the website, if you go under Consultant Tools, one of the tools that we added is this Consultant's Roadmap. And it really came out of Bonnie's question. In the last training session, Bonnie, you had asked, on the first day I remember, you felt a little bit confused about the order of steps and the process to go through. So we really created this to be a simpler roadmap to help you understand when you're facilitating, what are all the steps. So step 1 is the first day facilitation. You do your 8-step framework that you explain. You facilitate the discussion of their behaviors. Then you make additions from the fundamentals card, and you explain a little bit about how ritual is going to work and how the rollouts are going to work. That's what you're doing on the first day facilitation. Once you do that, then you do the process that I was just describing. You write in this first set of fundamentals. You go back and forth with the client to edit until you get to a final version. Once you have that final version, we're going to create the way cards, and it would also be an appropriate time to suggest that they might want to create flip books, because those are a good thing to give out at the rollout. We'll figure out what are the rituals. So you've had some initial conversation. Then we're going to figure out, well, what are the rituals that they're going to practice? We have to decide on that sometime before the rollout, because you're going to mention that to everybody in the rollout. Step 5 is you're going to plan the rollout, give them all the details of how to organize it, and then you're going to conduct the rollout session. Once we finish the rollout, we're typically going to start eMinder the next week, and they're going to start practicing their rituals every week, but we're going to get eMinder started. It's also a good time, step 7, to suggest that a coaching guide might be a very useful thing. Now that we've rolled this out, the coaching guide is a very useful tool for managers and supervisors to have more material to work with to teach from. That's the time we should also then order the baseline survey so we get a starting point to see how is this company at practicing their fundamentals as a starting point. And then somewhere 4 to 6 weeks later is a good time to go back and do a follow-up training session with their managers and supervisors to once again help teach them how to be better at using the fundamentals on a day-to-day basis. So this is just a simple roadmap for you to think through step by step, how do you run through the whole process. All right?
Thank you.
Any questions about that?
That's very helpful.
Good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So let's, at this point, shift gears and talk a little bit about marketing. And I want to share just 3 or 4 different thoughts that have come to me over the last month or so that are worth sharing about ideas around marketing and selling. So first, and these are not in any particular order, but just 3 or 4 different ideas. So first thing that is probably the most important is that, and this came out of a conversation I was having with David McGlennon when he was with me. We were doing a rollout. And is that what we were doing? I can't remember. No, he was hearing me do a Vistas talk. That's what we were doing. But anyway, it occurs to me that when we talk about this process and the fundamentals process, there really are the easiest way to think about it is that there are 3 steps to explaining what this process is all about and to selling. And it's the same 3 steps whether this is a 30-second elevator speech, this is a 3-hour seminar that you're doing, or whether this is a 30-minute sales call. It's the same 3 steps in the same order. It's just a question of, based on how much time you have, you either expand it or shrink it. So the first thing we're always establishing when I'm talking about this is I'm establishing for somebody the idea that culture is really important and why it's so important. So establishing the importance of culture to a company. And I'll go back and explain this a little bit more in a second. So that's the first step. Second step is establishing the notion or the idea that you can and should be intentional about this, that rather than leaving it to chance, it's vitally important to be intentional about it. And the third step is that we teach people how to do it. So if I'm doing the elevator pitch in the shortest version of this, I'm saying to somebody, you know, most people realize that the culture of your organization has a significant and a direct impact on how your people perform. You take people and you put them in 3 different cultures, and they will perform differently. And so the culture has a big impact on what they do. If you get that, then doesn't it make sense that as a leader, rather than just hoping the culture worked out, you would want to be really intentional about creating the culture that would have the highest chance of causing your people to perform at the highest levels? Of course that makes sense. Well, we teach companies how to do that. So I've done 3 things there. I've established the culture is important. I've established the notion that you should be intentional about it. And third, I've said we teach people how to do it. That's the 3 steps. It's always that. If I'm doing a 3-hour Vistage talk, it's the same 3 things. I spend the first 30 minutes or so showing in a variety of ways, and I shared some of this in the last training session, but I spend the first 30 minutes in a variety of different ways showing how culture is the biggest part of strategic competitive advantage, how culture makes money, how culture drives the bottom line, how culture drives productivity, all the various things you can do, but all of them have as a simple goal establishing in people's brain that, wow, culture is a really big deal and has a really big impact on our success. That's the first thing I do. Second thing I do in a Vistage talk is I explain the whole notion that for most people, culture is just accidental. And we can go through in a lot of depth the whole idea of where do cultures come from and help people to understand that in most organizations, the culture is mostly driven by personalities, and that most companies just allow their culture to happen on its own. But that really world-class companies realize how important this is to success, and so rather than just hoping it works out, they're incredibly intentional and purposeful and systematic about creating the culture they want. They don't leave any of it to chance. So we can spend a lot of time talking about being intentional about it versus just leaving it to chance, but that's the second step. So that could be a 30-second comment, or that could be a 30-minute discussion. And then the third step is the whole process of how we do it. If it's an elevator pitch, all I'm saying is, and we show companies how to do this. If it's a 10-minute conversation, I'm explaining the idea of creating behaviors and creating rituals to practice them. If I have a lot more time, I'm going over the entire 8-step framework, because the 8-step framework shows all the steps to make it happen. And then I'm going into a lot more depth on defining behaviors and creating rituals. But it's all still the same 3 basic ideas. Culture is really important to success. Number 2, you should be intentional instead of hoping it all works out. Number 3, here's the process for doing it. It's that simple. just expanded or contracted to fit whatever time you have available. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Very simple. All right. Second thing I want to talk about, and that is that a lot of conversations with my own clients and with each of you about prospects you're working on, or particularly centers of influence. And when we're talking to centers of influence, people who could lead us to a lot more business, there's such a, it's fascinating to me how common the tendency is for everybody to get all excited about the opportunities and the marketing plan and all the things we could do, and I could call all these people and we could send out these emails, and we spend all our time doing that and nothing ever gets done because then we get busy and nothing happens. And instead of doing that, I can't emphasize this more strongly, the best and most effective thing to do when you're with a center of influence is, after explaining what this is all about and assuming they're excited about it, is to say to them, let's just start with one client. Who's one client that you have that you think this would be a good fit for? One client you have that cares about their people a lot, that values culture. Let's get on the phone right now and make an appointment with them, and let's go talk to them. You know, if you just start with one, you know, once we do one client, you know, your center of influence or others, they'll understand, you know, how this works better. Then they'll better be able to see how to leverage this with other clients, how to talk about it with other clients. They'll see the power and the impact of it. But it's so common that everybody wants to make all kinds of big fancy marketing plans, and all that does is just get them bogged down. Just pick one darn client and get on the darn phone and call them and make an appointment to go see them. It's just a lot easier if you start with one. So I just strongly encourage you, just pick one instead of trying to figure out the whole big marketing plan. And the same even is true in your own work. You know, in, let's say, the case of Art and Bonnie as an example, you know, I know you guys are talking about your plans. You know, you could spend a lot of time talking about your marketing plans, or you could pick one client and get on the phone and call them and go do it. And I encourage you, pick one and go do it. The faster you do one, the more you'll understand after you do one. You'll understand it better, you'll be more confident, and now you'll start to see, you'll just feel more aggressive about going and talking to other people after you've done one versus when it's just an idea for you. So pick one and go do it. Best thing you can do.
Great.
All right. When you are following up with a client, one of the things that I find is, and we've talked about this before, is that I think I spend my whole life just following up with people. That, you know, if you get a prospect and they're right on top of it, yes, we're going to do this, or this sounds really exciting, and then, you know, you got to follow up next week, and then you can't get a hold of them, and they put you off, and you follow up the next week, and you follow up and follow up and follow up and follow up, and it's, you know, it's easier for people not to do something than it is for them to do something. So there's just inertia at play, and to make sales just requires tremendous amounts of follow-up. However, what I want to emphasize at this moment is that when you are following up and time has gone by, it's been 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 8 weeks since that initial conversation that they were all excited about this, and now you're following up again, I strongly encourage that the follow-up you're doing 7 weeks from now should be a follow-up to re-engage with a phone appointment. It should not be a follow-up to get an answer. Because if you're asking them for an answer and it's been 7 or 8 weeks since they were really excited, it's easier for them to say no because it's gotten cold. It's no longer exciting to them. They forgot the passion they had and the enthusiasm they had when you were right there with them talking about this, and this was going to be the greatest thing in the world. 7 or 8 weeks from now, or 2 months from now, or whatever, it's just gotten cold. It's just one more initiative that's on their plate along with all the other things that's on their plate, and you're following up and you're following up, and you finally get a hold of them, and you ask them, you know, so you're ready to move forward, and they're likely to say, you know, I think we got a lot of other things on our plate. I think we're going to do this. Maybe we'll think about this for 2016. That's just natural. And so it's better, before you get asked for a decision, once it's gotten cold, it's better to heat it back up. So if I'm following up again and again and again, it's been a while, the follow-up I'm making is, hey, let's schedule a phone appointment, talk a little bit more about that. And now when I'm on the phone appointment, now I'm re-energizing it, reheating it, and then we can talk about getting a decision. But a decision that you ask for when the prospect has gotten cold is much more likely to be no, because it's the path of least resistance than it is to be a yes. So when you're following up and time's gone by, reheat it before you ask for an answer. Questions about any of that? Last thing about marketing and selling is just a heads up that webinars. So we know that webinars, and some of you have used webinars and other work that you've done pretty effectively, and so we know that webinars can be a good way to engage prospects. I am doing a webinar next Tuesday for there's a client of mine that is a benefit consulting firm in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they do a monthly webinar for their clients on a variety of topics. And so I am their guest speaker to do a webinar next Tuesday morning, and I'm putting together the material for that, and it will be the first webinar that I've done on this topic, and so it'll be a good chance to kind of experiment with that, see how people respond to it, see what kind of business might get generated from that. And I have another one that's scheduled in October for an organization called the Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers. It's a national council of insurance agencies. So that's in October. But I mention this to you because we will put up on the website in the Resource Center the slides from the webinar and make them available for you to use. So two things. One is, if you want to do your own webinars, we can make the slides that we create available to you. Secondly, based on how this first or second webinar goes, I'm expecting that we will start to do regular webinar, and it'll be basically the same webinar, just more prospects each time. But if we did that webinar, once every month or once every 6 or 8 weeks and just invited prospects to it, if we decide to do that, which I think we likely will, we'll let you know, and you can just sign up for that too. You just have your prospects and tell them, hey, there's an HPC webinar coming up on this date. You might want to sign up for this, and just have your prospects sign up for our webinar, and then you can just follow up with them from there. So make it even easier. So just a heads up that that's on its way. Okay?
Cool.
All right. So let's shift now into your situation. So what questions do you have? What prospects are you running into? What could you use more help or insight on that others might also benefit from? Anybody?
You good?
Yes.
Sal. Hey, one thing I'm bumping into a little bit is what if you have a situation specifically with a center of influence who are, you're just trying to get them to spread our message, and be out looking for prospects, etc. A question I'm hearing a couple times now is, and they might not have necessarily articulated it specifically, but this is kind of the heart of it is, all right, if they're out with a prospect, and obviously I love your 3-step. If you have the time to follow that, but along those lines, are there some specific things, and I think you touched on it a little bit in terms of, what are some really quick byproducts, positive byproducts of why someone should engage us? Things like you're talking about productivity, drive bottom line. I guess I'm wondering, is there, and maybe there's not, but is there a very quick, efficient message for why somebody should talk to us? That's it. Plain and simple. Short answer.
Yeah.
Like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So a couple things I'd say. I'll answer that, but before I do, I would also say that with a center of influence, the best thing you can do is get them as a client.
Great point.
Even at a discounted rate, because once they are doing it, two things. One is once they are doing it, they will become evangelists.
Yep.
You know, they will talk about it very different when they're saying to their clients and friends and others, "Wait till I tell you what we're doing. We're doing the coolest thing in our company. You got to do this." That's just very different than "I know a guy."
Great point.
So they're going to become evangelists, and they're going to understand it at a completely different level when they're doing it themselves. And so, you know, that's why it's worth, even if you extend to them what you might call center of influence pricing, do it at a lower rate just for them. It's just like, if I'm a center of influence and I go and I tell a prospect, "Oh, you got to do this thing," and they ask me, "Well, do you do this?" and I say no, well, then what kind of credibility does that, you know, referral have? So I would push hard on that. But let's go back to, you know, the basic question, because whether it's a center of influence or anybody else, you know, what are some things you can say to really engage people quickly? So Sean sent out a piece that I came up with recently in advance of a Vistage talk that I'm doing, and that you can use for meetings as well. But it's an interesting thought, and if you took a look at that piece, there were 4 questions that I want a Vistage speaker to ask their members in advance of my talk, to have them thinking about. And those questions were: 1, you know, name 3 people in your company you wish you could clone. You know, everybody has some people they think, "Oh, if everybody was like Mary, this would be the greatest place in the world." So name 3 people you wish you could clone. Number 2, what specific things do those people do that make you want to clone them? "Oh, they do these specific behaviors. That's why you want to clone them." 3 is, you know, what would be the impact in your organization if you could get everybody in the organization being more like that? And how would that impact your bottom line if you could do that? And so those are good kind of questions that you could ask a prospect, or a center of influence could ask a prospect. Because if you get people, like, the whole topic of culture is so amorphous and nebulous. But if you could break it down to something a little more concrete, like, "Hey, you got people in your company, I'll bet, who you wish you could clone. Name a couple of those guys for me." "Oh, it's Mary, John, and Sarah," whatever. Okay, so what do they do that make you want to clone them? "Oh, they're so engaged, and they work so hard, and they're great team players, and they're this and they're that." All right, so what if you could get everybody in your company being like that? Like, how big would that be? I'd be amazing if I could get everybody being like them. Well, would you like to know about how to do that? Sure, I'd like to know about that. Well, I know a company that can help you with that.
I like that.
That's really what it's about. Then it's more concrete than they can visualize that more than they can working on their culture.
David, this said Curry. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
In my Vistage one-to-ones last week, this is no kidding, I had 6 different one-to-ones where the key discussion point was people problems, which next step is culture.
Yeah.
I mean, these smaller companies are just loaded with the problems, and they don't know where to go. And you know the classic case, they don't have the time. So for me personally, in the world I fish, the pond I'm in, they just have it almost immediately. It takes me a minute to get to it.
Yep. The process to them. So I'm assuming you're doing all these, Ed, right?
You and I should have a chat. I think my world's a little different, but I think I have 8 or 10 who already did from your prior presentations. What I am finding with them, I'm doing queries as I go around. It's broken down. The ritual's broken down.
Yep.
So if you said to me, what would be an important point of leverage, it would be reinstituting the rituals in those who had religion but have somehow slipped.
Yeah, and that is the danger of doing it on your own. And I've said this, I'm trying to think where I was. I think I was in a Vistage talk recently, and somebody asked about, where does it break down? What keeps people from doing this successfully? And when I'm asked that, there's sort of 2 answers I give to that. One is, the single biggest determinant of success is CEO sponsorship. Without the CEO being passionate about it, it is never going to work. But then the second thing is, if a company, and I say this in a way that's not self-serving, but if a company tries to do it on their own, they're just not as likely to stick with it and to really do it effectively as if they have outside accountability. If there's somebody from the outside who's driving the process, making sure it gets done in the first place, and then staying on top of them to make sure the process really gets deeply embedded, there's just a much, much higher probability of success than if you try to do it yourself. No different than an athlete trying to coach himself with no accountability versus having a professional coach. We're the professional coaches, and you can do this on your own, but your chances of success are just a lot lower. And those companies that tried to do it on their own did better than if they didn't try, but without a professional coach, they're just not as likely to be able to stick with it or do it successfully.
Agreed.
Other things that you're bumping into or could use some extra insight on.
David,
Anybody?
this is Bonnie.
Yes.
I'm
Bonnie.
speaking of Thursday to a nonprofit, and I'm guessing that I'm going to run up against, yes, we think this is wonderful, but the add-ons, like with the flip chart, the e-minder, the coaching guide, that they wouldn't see, they would say they don't have the resources for those items. What would you say to that?
A couple things, 3 things. So first thing is you may want to consider whatever you're charging them for your consulting piece. You may want to consider giving them whatever price you think could work, and you could call it, your special nonprofit pricing, so that they feel like they're getting, a good deal to reflect the fact that they're a nonprofit. Because as we talked about before, just at this point, the faster you get experience doing it, the better. So even at a lower price point, it's worth you getting at a price point that they can buy it, so that you can go through the process and learn and experience it. Second thing I would say is that as it relates to the additional pieces, to a certain extent, you're undermining the value of your investment if you don't do the rest of it. So why spend the money to do it part way when the success of it is going to be undermined because you don't have all the pieces you need to be successful? You're wasting your time, you're wasting your money. Third thing I would say from a purely budgetary standpoint is I have a client, a nonprofit client up in the Boston area, a real good client, and what they've done is they went to one of their funding sources, one of their donors. Every nonprofit has a variety of donors besides whether they have government funding in addition to private donations, and they went to a funder and said, hey, I appreciate all that you contribute to us. This is a program we'd like to do, and I actually did this for eMinder. This is a program we'd like to do that'll have really big impact. Is this something you'd be willing to target your donation dollars towards? So they could pick a funder and go get it funded. Is another approach.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Related to that is a lot of their employees don't have email.
They don't have company email, or they don't have email?
Definitely, they don't have company email. Some don't have any email.
Yeah, I would say so. If they don't have any email, it's obviously eMinder isn't going to work for them, nor will a lot of other things. But most people, my experience is that there are very few people these days that have no email at all. There just aren't many. They may not be on the company email. So what we've done in those situations, I have a number of clients like that. I have a large nonprofit in Arizona, about 250 people, and there's probably only 125 of them, maybe half of them are on company email. The rest of them are a lot of part-timers, and they just went to all their people and got email addresses. because they figured, you know what, they should have their email addresses anyway, whether they have them, or, you know, they may not have them right now, but it's just a darn good idea to have a personal email address for them if they don't have a company email, just so you can communicate with them. Forget, you know, eMinder, that's just a good thing anyway. But so they just went out to the people and collected email addresses. So when we're talking about eMinder specifically, eMinder sending out an email to whoever and a lesson to whatever email address we have. eMinder couldn't care less whether it's a Gmail, a Hotmail, or a company email address.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions or things you're running into, could use insight on. All right, if there's nothing else, our next call, so next month, the first Monday is Labor Day, I believe, in September. Yes, the first Monday in September is Labor Day, and so we will do this call on the second Monday, which is Monday the 14th. So Monday the 14th at 8 o'clock will be the next call. And for those Eagles fans, it's also opening night for the Eagles. So that makes it a very important day.
Oh, Lord.
All right, so mark your calendars for Monday the 14th. Keep me posted on how you're doing, and let me know if you need any help with anything.
Thank you, David.
Will do.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
You're welcome. My pleasure. You guys have a great day. All right.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, David?
Yes.
Hey, can I call you back? I wanted a couple of questions about a meeting today. I'll call you right back.
Sure, you bet.
All right, bye-bye.